The last weeks of the Third Reich began with a sound no one expected, the low growl of truck engines echoing through the night as convoys slipped out of Berlin under blankets of darkness. They moved without insignia, without lights, and without explanation. SS guards stood at every intersection, waving them forward with a sense of urgency normally reserved for battlefronts. But these vehicles weren't carrying soldiers. They carried something far more valuable. Inside, the crates were gold bars pulled from the Reichsbank vaults, bundles of foreign currency seized from occupied nations, jewelry stripped from prisoners of the concentration camps, art wrapped so tightly in protective cloth that even the drivers didn't know what they were guarding. Everything the regime had stolen for 12 brutal years was now being evacuated, piece by piece, into the mountains. The Alps. The last place Hitler believed he could hold the world at bay. To the Allies, fragmented intelligence began to surface in the form of intercepted cables, hurried reports from resistance groups, and testimonies from captured officers. Rumors spoke of a national treasure convoy heading south, a financial lifeline meant for a final stand, a retreat into an Alpine redoubt where Nazi leaders dreamed of prolonging the war for months, even years. But behind the rumors was something more dangerous, the possibility that the Reich was attempting to disappear its entire wealth before Germany fell. Gold that could fund an insurgency, currency that could help fleeing SS officers rebuild networks abroad, art that could vanish forever into private vaults or be destroyed out of spite. American intelligence understood the stakes instantly. OSS agents sifted through captured documents, tracing patterns hidden in half-burned memos. Counterintelligence corps teams interrogated prisoners who tried desperately to lie their way out of the truth. Every clue pointed toward the same destination. The convoys were heading deep into the Bavarian and Austrian Alps, toward mines, tunnels, and salt caverns that had existed for centuries. A race began, one fought across collapsing roads, bombed bridges, and retreating armies. On one side, SS units trying to bury the wealth of a dying empire. On the other, American spies and soldiers racing to find it before it disappeared forever. And behind both, the looming shadow of the Red Army, closing in from the east, determined to reach Berlin and anything leaving it before anyone else. No one knew how much treasure was being moved. No one knew where the convoys would stop. No one knew how many mines were rigged with explosives, or how far the SS was willing to go to keep their secrets buried. But every hour that passed tightened the tension across Allied command and pushed OSS teams deeper into hostile territory. In the chaos of a world collapsing, one truth crystallized. The last battle for Hitler's fortunes would not be fought with tanks or bombers, but with intelligence reports, interrogation notes, and the relentless pursuit of a secret that now threaded its way through the mountains. And somewhere in the heart of those mountains, far below the snow, behind thick walls of salt and stone, waited a discovery so vast that even hardened generals would struggle to comprehend it. The story of the Nazi treasure convoys does not begin on the road. It begins in the vaults of the Reichsbank, years before the Third Reich began to crumble. In the late 1932, as Hitler prepared Germany for war, his planners understood an essential truth. Modern conflict required not only soldiers and weapons, but vast financial reserves. Gold, foreign currency, and liquid assets became strategic tools capable of stabilizing economies, purchasing critical resources, and financing arms production. From the moment the regime seized power, the Reichsbank became both a banking institution and a vault for the ambitions of a nation preparing for total war. As Germany expanded across Europe, this vault grew. Each conquest brought more wealth. Gold taken from the national banks of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, the Netherlands, and beyond was melted down, stamped with Reich insignia, and stacked into neat bars that disappeared underground. Currency from occupied territories was collected, sorted, and redistributed to fuel the German economy. Even worse was the personal property confiscated from civilians, especially Jewish families and concentration camp prisoners, rings, watches, coins, and valuables that were stripped, catalogued, and stored with bureaucratic precision. The financial administration of the Reich became a vast machinery designed not only for war but for theft. For years, this flow of wealth seemed unstoppable. German armies advanced, and the Reichsbank's reserves swelled. But by 1943, the picture began to change. The defeats at Stalingrad and El Alamein signaled a shift. The Allied bombing campaign began to drain Germany's industrial capacity. More importantly, the world's intelligence agencies started focusing on German financial movements. American and British analysts combed through captured documents, tracked railway shipments, and observed unusual transfers of gold within occupied territories. They noticed patterns, unexplained movements of wealth, changes in storage practices, and sudden secrecy surrounding certain vaults. The OSS, still a young agency, had a special interest in these developments. Its analysts understood that economic warfare could be as decisive as battlefield victories. If the Reich's financial networks were disrupted, the German war machine would weaken. If the Allies could identify where the wealth was stored, they could prevent SS officers from using it after the war to build underground networks or finance resistance movements. By 1944, the intelligence picture sharpened. Reports emerged suggesting that the Reich was preparing contingency plans to safeguard its fortune. The rumors centered on a single idea. If Germany collapsed, the leadership would retreat into the Alps and wage a last stand from a fortified redoubt known as the Alpine Festung, the Alpine fortress. The concept was part fantasy, part propaganda, but it spread quickly. Allied planners took it seriously, not because they believed the fortress existed, but because they understood how desperate regimes behave when collapse becomes inevitable. In Berlin, the mood inside the Reichsbank darkened. Bombings grew more frequent. Supply chains disintegrated. The streets around the bank filled with refugees and wounded soldiers. High-ranking bankers and SS officers held closed-door meetings under increasing pressure. They knew Berlin would fall eventually. They also knew that the wealth stored beneath their feet could not fall into Allied hands. Then the orders changed. Gold was to be moved south, toward Thuringia and Bavaria. Currency stocks were to be transported in armored trucks. Crates labeled with false manifests were loaded onto trains bound for the mountains. SS escorts supervised every shipment. Records were burned. Some vaults were emptied entirely. The evacuation was not chaotic. It was organized, deliberate, and executed with the kind of discipline that had defined the early years of the Reich. American intelligence began intercepting fragments of these changes. In liberated France, OSS teams interrogated, captured SS officers and economic administrators. Some lied. Some broke under pressure. Some repeated rumors they barely understood. But every scrap of information pointed in a similar direction. The treasure was moving toward the Alps. At the same time, local resistance groups across Europe noticed unusual activity. In Austria, villagers saw heavily guarded convoys passing through mountain roads at night. In Bavaria, railway workers reported crates being transferred into old mines and tunnels. Some shipments were disguised as industrial machinery or medical supplies. Others were escorted by SS units that refused to answer questions. Each observation added to a growing mosaic, a mosaic OSS analysts were desperate to complete. By late 1944, the situation in Berlin deteriorated further. The Red Army approached from the east. American armored divisions advanced from the west. Government ministries evacuated. Files disappeared into fires that burned for days. Into this chaos stepped men from the Reich Security Main Office, the SS, and the Finance Ministry, all tasked with ensuring that the wealth of the Reich did not fall into enemy hands. Some wanted to preserve it to rebuild Germany after the war. Some wanted to hide it to finance a future Nazi underground. Others simply feared being arrested without something to bargain with. The motives varied, But the movement did not stop. As the Nazi state collapsed, the treasure convoys accelerated. Trucks rumbled out of Berlin in long columns, loaded with gold bars strapped beneath tarps and crates of banknotes stacked to the roof. Loaded trains wound through the countryside toward remote valleys. SS officers with sealed orders coordinated transfers at night, ensuring that only trusted personnel knew the routes and destinations. The Alps became the destination because they offered something no other region could: geographic protection. Mountains riddled with centuries-old mines. Salt caverns large enough to hold entire museums. Remote villages loyal to the regime or too afraid to resist. Roads that could be blocked with a single demolition. For a collapsing government, the Alps represented the illusion of control. But the Allies were moving faster than expected. American armored divisions broke through defenses in the west and pushed toward the heart of Germany. OSS teams followed in their wake, collecting every scrap of intelligence left behind. Counterintelligence corps units interrogated civilians and captured soldiers, searching for details about convoys, mine entrances, and rumored vaults. Then came the report that changed everything. In early April 1945, soldiers from the U.S. 90th Infantry Division entered a small village in Thuringia. Local civilians whispered that the Nazis had hidden something important in a mine nearby. They spoke cautiously, glancing over their shoulders as if the SS could still emerge from the shadows. The soldiers relayed the information to CIC officers. The officers ordered an investigation. The mine was called Merkers. The Americans descended into its depths, expecting nothing more than a few crates. What they found instead would shock even the highest-ranking generals. By early 1945, the German state was living its final months in a state of accelerating collapse. The Eastern Front disintegrated under relentless Soviet pressure, and each loss triggered new waves of panic within the German administration. Cities that once felt distant from the war became battlefields. Supply lines fractured. Civilian rail traffic gave way to military evacuations. Yet, amid the chaos, one effort remained strangely organized: the movement of money, gold, and cultural treasures away from Berlin. The Reich's financial administrators were not the only ones making preparations. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, understood the strategic value of the cultural artifacts stored in German museums and stolen from across Europe. He also understood that many SS officers prioritized destruction over preservation. The conflict between these factions created a bizarre environment where men who agreed on almost nothing else fought over the fate of crates and paintings, even as their country collapsed around them. Meanwhile, intelligence reports flowing into Allied headquarters painted a picture of a regime scattering its wealth across the Alps. Some reports described bullion shipments hidden in old copper mines. Others suggested that priceless paintings were being stacked behind sealed walls in salt caverns. Each new fragment hinted at a more complex pattern. This was not a random scattering of assets. It was a systematic relocation. OSS analysts tasked with tracking the Reich's final movements struggled to differentiate truth from rumor. Messages intercepted from German units often contradicted each other. Civilians fleeing occupied towns brought stories that blended reality with fear. Even within the SS, different departments issued conflicting orders regarding gold shipments. But certain trends emerged. First, large quantities of gold had been transferred from Berlin to the town of Merkers in Thuringia. Second, specialized SS units were directing additional convoys deeper into Austria toward regions known for their extensive networks of salt and magnesium mines. Third, the idea of an Alpine fortress, even if exaggerated, had influenced German planning. Documents captured in late 1944 indicated that high-ranking officials feared that Germany might lose its industrial base in the west and southwest, but hoped to survive a little longer by retreating to fortified mountain positions. For the Allies, the possibility that Nazi leaders could regroup in the Alps was an alarming one. Army even reached Bavaria, American intelligence officers discussed the feasibility of a last-stand redoubt capable of prolonging the war. These discussions were based on partial truths and embellished reports, but they were plausible enough to influence strategy. The U.S. 7th Army and 3rd Army were instructed to push toward the Alpine regions with speed, not only to prevent a potential stronghold, but to capture the industrial, cultural, and financial infrastructure that might enable a prolonged resistance. That meant securing bridges, rail lines, and crucially, mining facilities that could be used as storage sites. Inside Germany, the transportation of treasure continued through March. The Reich's internal banking systems were nearly paralyzed. Communications were erratic. Regions declared emergencies without waiting for orders. Amid this turmoil, SS officers overseeing gold transports became increasingly isolated from central authority. Some followed their directives faithfully. Others attempted to hide portions of the wealth, hoping to use it as currency for escape. At the same time, Hitler issued the Nero Decree, an order demanding the destruction of Germany's infrastructure to prevent Allied use. This decree placed every mine, tunnel, and vault containing art or gold at immediate risk. Many German officials quietly ignored the order, fearing that carrying it out would forever stain their names. The tension between destruction and preservation intensified as the Allies crossed the Rhine. Civilians and lower-ranking German personnel in the Alps understood that the end was near. They continued their work under threat, but whispers of surrender grew louder. Resistance groups in Austria and Bavaria, long suppressed by the Gestapo, began passing information to American contacts. They reported strange activity around the Aussee mine, a sprawling salt cavern complex large enough to hold an entire cathedral. The more OSS analysts pieced together the data, the clearer the pattern became. Germany's wealth was being funneled into the mountains not to create a fortress, but because those caves offered the safest hiding places left in a nation collapsing under fire. In early April, when the US Third Army reached Thuringia, the treasure trail became unmistakable. Units encountered abandoned supply vehicles with crates stamped with atypical markings. They seized documents left behind in offices emptied overnight. In some cases, they found gold coins or bullion scraps buried in shallow pits as retreating officers attempted to lighten their loads. But the most significant clue came from civilians whose lives had been upended by the sudden arrival of SS convoys. In one village, farmers described trucks covered with tarpaulins driving toward the nearby Merkers mine. Others recalled guards forbidding anyone from approaching the area. Even children noticed that the convoys had more armed escort vehicles than usual. These patterns, once reported to CIC officers, triggered immediate action. On the 4th of April 1945, American forces entered Merkers and secured the town. When questioned, local women quietly revealed that the SS had spent days transporting crates inside the mine. At first, the claim sounded like rumor. But when CIC officers pressed further, the stories converged. The mine wasn't storing ore, it was storing something valuable enough for the SS to guard it day and night. This intelligence reached the ears of General George S. Patton and his superiors quickly. Patton, known for his instinct for decisive action, ordered a thorough investigation. Within hours, a team descended into the mine. What they found exceeded every expectation. Vault-like chambers carved into the earth, walls stacked with gold bars sealed in crates, piles of foreign currency in bundled stacks, bags filled with valuables confiscated from concentration camp prisoners, artwork hidden behind wooden slats. It was as though the economic heart of the Nazi state had been transplanted into the mountain. But even as the Americans documented and secured the Merkers discovery, new intelligence arrived from deeper within Austria. Resistance fighters had located a second, even more significant cache, one containing not gold or currency, but thousands of cultural masterpieces stolen from across Europe. And this mine, unlike Merkers, had been wired with explosives. The hunt for Nazi treasure was not a single operation, but a convergence of human instincts, tactical precision, ideological fear, and collapsing authority. To understand why the American pursuit across the Alps became one of the most extraordinary intelligence missions of the war, you have to look at the intersecting angles that shaped every decision. Some unfolding in dimly lit interrogation rooms, others in mountain passes where winter still clung to the rock. The first angle was human. The war was ending, but no one felt safe. German officers feared court-martial if they mishandled state assets, yet feared the Allies even more. Civilians feared what would happen when the front lines shifted. Bank clerks, mine workers, drivers, and guards all lived inside a fog of rumor. They saw gold convoys, but had no idea why they mattered. They heard whispers about the SS hiding wealth, but didn't know where. Some kept silent out of fear. Others spoke quietly to Americans because they believed the world they knew was collapsing and someone needed to know the truth. Every piece of information was filtered through human emotion, fear, loyalty, desperation, and sometimes guilt. Many Germans understood that the treasures being hidden did not belong to the Reich in any moral sense. They had been stolen from nations, museums, and families across Europe. Some civilians, when questioned, revealed information simply because they wanted to see the war end and the truth preserved. The second angle was intelligence. OSS operatives were trained to listen for patterns hidden inside chaos. They cross-matched prisoner interrogations with railway schedules, convoy sightings with weather reports, and intercepted German communications with economic analyses. They looked for inconsistencies. Why would a mine produce no ore shipments for months, yet see heavy security traffic at night? Why would the Reichsbank transfer gold into a region with no financial infrastructure? Why were artworks that once hung in the museums of Paris, Florence, Vienna, and Krakow suddenly vanishing from German cultural inventories? These patterns forced a shift in Allied thinking. The treasure was not scattered randomly. It was being centralized in places that were hard to bomb, hard to invade, and easy to defend. Ancient mines became vaults, salt caverns became museums. The Alps, without firing a shot, had become the container for the Reich's last hopes. This led to the third angle tactical planning, the US. Army had to advance quickly, cutting through regions where road networks twisted through dense forests and rising slopes. The Third Army moved with a sense of urgency, not only to capture towns but to secure tunnels, shafts, and high-value sites before either the SS or the Red Army reached them. The Americans were racing geography itself. If treasure convoys slipped into remote Alpine valleys and sealed their entrances behind them, it could take decades to uncover them if they were ever found at all. Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower understood this. They saw the treasure as more than valuable assets. It represented evidence proof of Nazi crimes, the scale of economic plunder, the machinery of genocide. If it vanished, accountability would vanish with it. This fear fueled an aggressive campaign to secure any site that might conceal loot or documents. The fourth angle was the enemy's psychological breakdown. As Germany collapsed, SS officers guarding the treasure operated in a strange dual world. They were loyal to a regime that no longer existed in practical terms. They had strict orders to protect the caches, yet many were already planning their own escape routes. Some hoped to trade information for leniency. Others clung to fantasies that the Alpine fortress would form a new base of resistance. The fear of capture turned these officers into unreliable guardians. Some abandoned their posts, others followed their orders rigidly until the last moment. This instability created openings that OSS and CIC teams exploited carefully. Interrogators noticed patterns in these officers' behavior. Those who were deeply ideological rarely spoke, but those who feared retribution often revealed details, accidentally a location, a name, a convoy size, clues that, when assembled, mapped the path of hidden wealth across the mountains. The fifth angle was the landscape itself. The Alps were not a backdrop, they were a character in the story. Every road, every ridge, every tunnel shaped the pursuit. Snowmelt turned paths into mud, landslides blocked passage. Mines were accessible only through narrow roads that a single destroyed bridge could isolate. The treasure hunt became a battle against nature as much as the enemy. The geography also created silence. Mines like Merkers and Aussee had been carved deep into the earth over centuries. Their tunnels absorbed sound. Their shafts stretched for kilometers. They were ideal hiding places precisely because they erased the outside world. Within their depths, treasures could sit unseen for decades. Without human testimony, the Americans would have never found them. The sixth angle was leadership. At the tactical level, young CIC officers led squads into towns they had never heard of, relying only on a hunch or a fragment of information. OSS commanders coordinated intelligence from France, Switzerland, and Italy to form a composite view of German evacuation routes. At the strategic level, Eisenhower and Patton understood that securing mines and tunnels mattered as much as capturing cities. Their decisions pushed armored divisions directly toward the areas most likely to hide the Reich's wealth. But leadership was also present on the German side in forms that helped the Allies more than the SS intended. Albert Speer quietly undermined scorched earth orders. Austrian mine engineers resisted instructions to destroy cultural treasures. Some local officials stalled SS demolition plans by claiming equipment shortages. These acts of disobedience, small and private, saved tens of thousands of artworks from annihilation. The seventh angle was moral. The Americans confronting the treasure faced a difficult truth. Everything they found represented human suffering. Gold bars, molded from melted coins taken from national banks. Bags filled with dental gold from concentration camps. Furniture crates holding priceless paintings ripped from the walls of Jewish homes. Nothing in those vaults was clean. The deeper soldiers descended into the mines, the heavier the air grew not because of dust or temperature, but because they could feel the weight of history pressing in from all sides. This moral weight influenced how the Allies documented, catalogued, and protected what they found. They knew that the world after the war would judge them not only by how they fought, but by how they handled the recovery of stolen heritage and wealth. All of these angles, human, tactical, geographic, psychological, moral, created a convergence that was leading inevitably towards something hidden far beneath the mountains. The clues pointed not to one discovery, but two: the gold of the Reichsbank in Merkers and, deeper in the Austrian Alps, the greatest collection of stolen art in history. The Americans would soon find them both. To fully understand the magnitude of what the Americans were chasing, you have to examine the deeper structures beneath the surface: economic, cultural, psychological, and operational. These layers reveal why the race for Hitler's hidden wealth mattered far beyond gold bars or accounting sheets. It was about the future of Europe, the moral reconstruction of a continent, and the prevention of a hidden war after the official one ended. One of the most critical angles was economic. For 12 years, the Nazi regime had looted Europe on a scale without precedent. National banks from Warsaw to Brussels were stripped of their reserves. Central treasuries in Vienna, Prague, and Amsterdam were emptied. German occupation policies forced the sale or confiscation of assets from millions of civilians. The Reich instituted a vast system of plunder, not only to enrich itself, but to fuel its war machine. Without this stolen wealth, Germany's military expansion would have collapsed years earlier. By 1945, however, the regime's economic foundation was crumbling. The Reichsbank struggled to maintain value in its currency. Factories were destroyed. Trade routes were severed. As cities burned, the only financial foundation that remained stable was gold, the universal reserve, the asset that could survive any regime. Germany's last hope for post-war survival, whether through negotiation or escape, depended on safeguarding this bullion. American intelligence recognized this. If the gold disappeared into the Alps, it could re-emerge in foreign banking systems, funding clandestine Nazi networks for decades. With the looming Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union understood the strategic value of controlling Germany's financial core. The gold was not just wealth, it was power, leverage, and evidence. Another angle was cultural. The treasure convoys did not only carry gold, they carried the cultural soul of Europe. The Madonna of Bruges, the Ghent altarpiece, Greek and Roman sculptures, Renaissance paintings, medieval manuscripts, and countless other objects stolen by the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg and the Kunstschutz units. These items had been ripped from museums, churches, and private homes with a precision matching the Reich's economic theft. These works were priceless not because of their material value, but because they represented the heritage of nations. Their loss would have shattered centuries of cultural continuity. Their destruction, an outcome seriously contemplated by SS teams, would have been an irreplaceable catastrophe. OSS cultural officers, later known as the Monuments Men, understood this angle intimately. Their mission was not a luxury assignment, it was a moral counterstrike against erasure. They followed cracks of information across front lines, piecing together clues about where masterpieces had vanished. As Allied soldiers advanced, these officers moved with them, armed with photographs, catalogues, and lists of missing works. This cultural layer added an emotional weight to the hunt. It transformed the operation from a simple seizure of assets into a rescue mission for the memory of civilization itself. The third angle was operational strategy. The Americans were fighting a race on three fronts simultaneously. First, against the SS officers who guarded the last convoys. Second, against the terrain that threatened to isolate hidden sites. Third, against the clock, the Red Army's rapid advance meant that Soviet forces could reach some Alpine regions before the Americans. This competition was not hostile in theory, but in practice, whoever reached the caches first would control the narrative and the evidence of Nazi economic crimes. Both sides understood that possession was power. Documents found with the treasure could implicate individuals, reveal bank networks, and expose the mechanisms of Hitler's war machine. The Americans were determined that this evidence fall into their hands. The fourth angle was psychological warfare. German propaganda had pushed the idea of the Alpine fortress as a strategic fallback. While the fortress never existed as described, the myth had influence. Some German units believed it, some civilians believed it. Even some Allied planners considered it plausible. Rumors spread of fortifications in mountain passes, secret laboratories, and vast stores of ammunition hidden beneath the peaks. These stories created a fog of uncertainty. The Americans feared that if Nazi leadership escaped into the mountains with gold, weapons, and loyal troops, they could continue fighting or negotiate from a position of strength. Thus, when convoys disappeared into Alpine valleys, they seemed to feed directly into the fortress myth, even though the reality was often far simpler. The regime simply needed a place to hide its stolen wealth before the end came. This psychological dimension influenced American strategy deeply. It forced OSS teams to infiltrate villages perched on cliffs, interrogate local leaders, and cross-check every rumor. It created an atmosphere where treasure and danger became intertwined. A fifth angle was the collapsing chain of command inside Nazi Germany. As the Allies pushed into Bavaria and Austria, the SS lost its ability to coordinate large-scale operations. Some officers acted independently. Others followed outdated orders because they lacked new instructions. In places like Aussee, where the greatest collection of stolen art had been hidden, this confusion created both danger and opportunity. Several high-ranking Nazis wanted the art destroyed rather than captured. They ordered explosives placed inside the mine. But local workers resisted, knowing the cultural significance of what lay inside. Some stalled for time, some removed detonators. Some simply refused to cooperate. In these mines, the moral resistance of ordinary people became as important as the tactical advances of the Allied armies. Another crucial angle was the race between intelligence and chaos. Each day brought new information, but also new complications. Documents were burned as German units retreated. Mines were sealed. Convoys broke into smaller groups to avoid detection. Even when OSS agents pinpointed a likely location, the situation could shift before they arrived. And yet, despite all the uncertainty, the Americans kept closing in. Merkers was the first major breakthrough, but even as US forces catalogued its vast holdings, more reports pointed deeper into Austria towards salt caverns rumored to contain treasures far beyond gold. Inside OSS analytic cells, the picture sharpened. The Merkers discovery was proof that Nazi loot had indeed migrated into the mountains. The next caches would likely follow the same pattern: large, secure, deep underground. This realization aligned with reports from Austrian miners, railway workers, and resistance groups who had watched German trucks vanish into narrow mountain roads near Aussee. The hunt now had direction. The Americans had found the Reich's wealth, and now they would pursue the Reich's stolen soul. Every angle, economic, cultural, tactical, psychological, moral, was converging toward a final confrontation with the hidden legacy of a collapsing empire. The breakthrough began quietly with a whisper from a frightened woman in a Thuringian village. She told American soldiers that the Nazis had taken everything valuable into the mine at Merkers. Her voice trembled as she spoke. In the final weeks of the war, even offering information could place civilians in danger. But her words aligned with what OSS analysts had already suspected. Somewhere in the region lay one of the vaults where the Reich had hidden its stolen wealth. CIC officers moved swiftly, interviewing miners, clerks, and anyone who might have seen the sudden increase in SS activity. Some villagers claimed they heard trucks arrive at night. Others said they saw vehicles with tarpaulins backed directly to the mine entrance. A few even recalled guards barking at them for walking too close to the site. These accounts formed a mosaic that pointed unmistakably toward the mine's central shafts. American troops secured the village on the 4th of April 1945. The mine itself, an extensive potassium and magnesium operation, was still operational, staffed by workers who were visibly relieved to see the Americans. When questioned, several miners independently confirmed that the SS had transported sealed crates into one of the deeper chambers. They described the crates as heavy, reinforced, and guarded. The details were too consistent to dismiss. The officers ordered a descent. The lift clattered downward, the sound echoing through vast caverns carved by decades of industrial activity. The air grew cooler as the team passed level after level. The mine's tunnels stretched in all directions, some wide enough for vehicles, others narrowing to single-person passageways. The miners guided them through the maze, their lanterns throwing long shadows across the walls. After several minutes of walking, they reached a large steel door bolted shut from the outside. The Americans forced it open. What lay beyond stopped them cold. In the chamber stood rows of wooden crates stacked nearly to the ceiling. Some were stenciled with markings familiar to Allied analysts' Reichsbank codes, foreign currency identifiers, registry numbers. Others bore no labels at all. When the Americans pried the first crate open, they stared at the contents in disbelief. Neatly stacked gold bars, each stamped with the Reichsbank seal. The officers immediately sent a dispatch to their superiors. Within hours, the news reached General George S. Patton. Patton, known for his intuition and unwillingness to waste time, ordered an immediate inspection. The next morning, he arrived at the mine with General Omar Bradley and General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The three commanders descended together, escorted by CIC officers who could barely contain their excitement. Even hardened military leaders accustomed to the logistics of war were unprepared for what they were about to see. As Eisenhower stepped into the chamber, the sheer scale of the discovery revealed itself fully. The cavern didn't just contain gold, it overflowed with it. Crates stacked higher than a man, piles of bullion arranged in rows that stretched into the gloom. Bags filled with foreign currency, some ripped open to reveal cascades of banknotes, boxes of coins from across Europe. In one corner, canvas sacks held personal valuables, rings, watches, and jewelry taken from concentration camp prisoners. The weight of the moment settled heavily in the silent air. This wasn't just money. This was the physical embodiment of 12 years of theft, violence, and plunder. The deeper the Americans explored the mine, the more astonishing the scope became. They found chambers filled with Reichsbank records, ledgers documenting the seizure of national treasuries, inventories from confiscated properties, detailed lists of gold deposits. They uncovered bags of gold teeth extracted from camp victims, a chilling reminder of the industrialized inhumanity of the regime. They found foreign currencies in vast quantities: Swiss francs, Dutch guilders, Belgian francs, French francs, and countless others, each representing a nation looted under occupation. The inventory teams worked methodically. They catalogued gold bars by weight and origin. They sealed off rooms containing sensitive documents. They established secure perimeters to prevent unauthorized access. Over the next several days, they calculated the value of the find. Approximately 100 tons of gold, millions in banknotes, and an untold amount of personal valuables. Nothing comparable had ever been discovered in modern history. For the OSS analysts, the discovery represented both validation and revelation. Their months of tracking rumors, interrogating prisoners, and following convoy patterns had led directly to the heart of the Reich's financial empire. The Merkers mine proved that the Nazis had indeed moved their reserves southward, just as the intelligence threads suggested. It also confirmed that more caches likely existed, perhaps containing even bigger treasures. In Washington, news of the Merkers find spread rapidly through military and political circles. The discovery was not immediately publicized. Its implications were too significant. The Americans needed time to secure the site, evaluate the contents, and determine what other caches might lie waiting in the mountains. Merkers was both a triumph and a warning. If this much wealth had been hidden here, what else had the regime concealed? The answer began to surface almost immediately. As the Americans stabilized the situation at Merkers, fresh intelligence arrived from Austria. A network of local resistance members and mine engineers reached out quietly to OSS contacts. They described a massive salt mine in the mountains near the village of Aussee, where the Germans had stored thousands of paintings, sculptures, and cultural artifacts. The mine was enormous kilometers of tunnels, chambers large enough to hold cathedrals, and conditions ideal for preserving delicate materials. Then came the most alarming detail. Parts of the mine had been rigged with explosives. The SS had wired the chambers with enough dynamite to obliterate everything inside. This matched reports indicating that Hitler's Nero decree extended not only to Germany's industries, but also to its stolen art. If carried out, thousands of the world's greatest cultural treasures, works by Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Vermeer, Jan van Eyck, Bruegel, and more would be lost forever. The Americans had no time to celebrate the discovery at Merkers. Another race was beginning, one even more urgent. The first cache had revealed the scale of the Reich's hidden wealth. The second cache threatened to erase the cultural history of half a continent, and the window to save it was closing fast. The intelligence coming out of Austria was unlike anything the OSS had received before. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was a coordinated plea from people who had risked their lives working inside one of the Nazis' most secret facilities. They described corridors carved into pure salt, chambers the size of cathedrals, and crates stacked wall to wall with Europe's stolen masterpieces. They also described something far more urgent: dynamite, hundreds of kilograms of it wired throughout the mine. If the explosives were triggered, Nothing inside would survive. This wasn't an idle threat. Hitler's Nero decree had already called for the destruction of Germany's infrastructure to prevent its use by the Allies. Some SS commanders interpreted this order as license to obliterate cultural property as well. Many of the stolen artworks held symbolic value for the nations Germany despised. If the Reich could no longer display them, some officers believed it should deny them to the world forever. The mine at Aussee had become the final battlefield in a war not for land, but for memory. American forces advancing into Austria understood the stakes implicitly. They moved quickly, pushing through towns that had fallen into disarray as the Nazi leadership fled. Resistance groups emerged from hiding and guided them toward areas where SS convoys had been spotted. Each report aligned with the others. The largest trove of stolen art anywhere in Europe was hidden inside the salt chambers. As US troops approached the region, Austrian miners worked quietly from within. These were men who had been ordered by the SS to assist with the placement of explosives. They had seen crates marked with the names of Europe's greatest museums. They understood what lay inside. They also understood that if the detonators were activated, the loss would be irreversible. Some of the miners delayed their work, tampered with wiring, or misdirected SS officers by claiming equipment failures. Their small acts of resistance bought precious time. Meanwhile, OSS cultural officers, later known as the Monuments Men, raced toward Aussee. These specialists, art historians, museum curators, architects, were unlike any other personnel in the army. They carried notebooks instead of rifles, catalogues instead of ammunition. Their mission was to save history, knowing that a single act of destruction could wipe out centuries of human achievement. The approach to the mine was steep and narrow, with switchback roads that clung to the side of the mountain. Snow still touched the upper slopes even in spring. The village at the base of the mine sat in an uneasy quiet, its residents watching the arrival of American troops with a mixture of relief and tension. Some had seen SS guards flee only hours earlier. Others knew that sabotage teams could still be lurking nearby. When the Americans reached the entrance, they found the mine open but deserted. The guards had pulled back deeper into the Alps as the front lines collapsed. Still, no one knew the condition of the wiring inside. The possibility of a timed explosive remained. No one could assume the art was safe. The first American teams descended cautiously. The tunnels stretched for kilometers, carved through salt that glittered faintly under their lamps. The temperature dropped as they walked deeper, the air thickening with the mineral scent of the mine. They passed carts and tools left behind by miners who had fled when the SS withdrew. Then they reached the first chamber. Stacks of crates filled the space. Some were marked with names that echoed through history: Bruegel, Vermeer, Rembrandt. Others bore the insignia of European museums. The Americans pried one open carefully. Inside lay a painting whose capture had been mourned across the world. Here it was, unharmed, perfectly preserved in the dry, cool environment of the salt cavern. The deeper they went, the more astonishing the collection became. Thousands of artworks lay hidden in the dark, sculptures wrapped in cloth, tapestries rolled delicately into tubes, manuscripts sealed in protective chests. Some items were looted from Jewish families, others taken from the Louvre, the Kunsthistorisches Museum, the Rijksmuseum, or private collections across Europe. The scope of the theft was staggering, but the soldiers could not admire the artworks for long. They still needed to find the explosives. Austrian miners who had worked under SS supervision soon emerged from hiding and approached the Americans. Nervous, exhausted, but relieved, they explained where the dynamite had been placed. The SS had intended to collapse the chambers by detonating strategic points in the tunnels. If the charges went off, the shockwaves would reduce the caverns to rubble. Guided by the miners, American engineers inspected the wiring that snaked along the rock. They found detonators removed, fuses cut, and certain charges missing sabotage carried out quietly by the miners themselves. Without their resistance, the entire collection might have been lost. Even with the primary threat mitigated, the Americans secured the mine methodically. They dismantled remaining charges, mapped the cavern network, and established guard posts at the entrances. The monuments men began cataloguing the artworks, recognizing piece after piece from lists of the most significant missing cultural treasures in Europe. One of the most striking discoveries was the Ghent altarpiece, the legendary 15th century masterpiece stolen from Belgium. Nearby stood Michelangelo's Madonna and Child, taken from Bruges and feared lost forever. These works alone represented irreplaceable cornerstones of European heritage, yet here they were, perfectly preserved in silence beneath the mountain. As news of the find reached Allied command, the significance of the operation became clear. The Merkers mine had revealed the financial core of the Nazi regime. Aussee revealed its cultural core. Between them, the Americans had prevented the destruction of both the Reich's wealth and the world's heritage. Interviews with local workers, captured officers, and rescued civilians confirmed how close Europe had come to catastrophe. One SS officer admitted that he had been ordered to destroy the entire collection if the Allies approached too quickly. Another explained that some Nazi leaders believed the art should not survive them, yet the sabotage by inaction of Austrian miners prevented these plans from being carried out. The Americans worked for weeks inside the mine, packing, cataloguing, and preparing the artworks for transport. Each crate removed from the cavern represented not only victory but preservation proof that the war had not succeeded in erasing the cultural memory of the continent. Above ground, the war continued, but the discovery at Aussee symbolized a shift. The Nazi regime had lost its ability to control anything, not armies, not finances, not even the destructive impulses of its own leaders. The Alps, once rumored to be Hitler's final fortress, had instead become the vault where the Allies reclaimed what the Reich had stolen. And though this mission was far from over, the momentum had changed. The Americans were not just liberating territories anymore. They were liberating the past. In the days following the discoveries at Merkers and Aussee, a quiet shift settled over the American forces involved. The war was still raging on multiple fronts, yet inside the tunnels and caverns of the Alps, soldiers, engineers, and intelligence officers found themselves confronting a different kind of battlefield. Instead of gunfire, they faced silence. Instead of ruined cities, they moved through underground vaults untouched by destruction. Instead of prisoners or enemy troops, they handled crates, archives, and evidence of theft on a scale the world had never seen. The immediate priority was security. The Americans knew that any lapse could result in looting, sabotage, or the loss of irreplaceable evidence. At Merkers, they established controlled access points, guarded by armed MPs day and night. Inventory teams continued cataloging gold bars, currency bundles, and personal valuables with meticulous precision. Each crate was assigned a code. Each code corresponded to Reichsbank documents found in the mine. The scale of the operation required accountants, engineers, linguists, and intelligence officers all working together in a mine shaft hundreds of meters below ground. The sheer volume of wealth was staggering. Tens of thousands of gold bars, currency from nearly every European nation, and enormous amounts of jewelry and valuables stripped from concentration camp prisoners. Some American soldiers later wrote that they had never before seen such material evidence of a regime built on systematic plunder. It changed the way they understood the war. The gold was not simply a resource. It was proof of how deeply the Nazi system had violated the economies and people of Europe. At Aussee, the atmosphere was different. The mine felt more like a sanctuary than a vault. The U.S. Army and monuments. Men handled every crate with deliberate care. Soldiers who had spent years in brutal combat, found themselves carrying sculptures wrapped in cloth or escorting paintings that had not seen daylight in years. Many later described it as surreal one-week fighting in ruined towns, the next safeguarding Michelangelo. As the Americans catalogued the artworks, they began to grasp the extraordinary breadth of the collection. Museums across Europe had compiled lists of stolen or missing pieces. The monuments men brought these lists into the mine and checked each item against the crates. Nearly every masterpiece believed lost to history appeared in these underground chambers. It was not just a recovery, it was a rescue. The official reports quickly reached Allied command. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton understood the significance of the discoveries. The treasures represented more than economic or artistic value. They were symbols of what the war had been fought to protect. The decision was made to transport the materials to secure facilities where their provenance could be verified and their return to rightful owners prepared. At Merkers, this meant loading crates of gold and currency onto U.S. Army trucks under heavy guard and moving them to Frankfurt. Teams documented everything during the process to prevent even the slightest discrepancy. These records would later form the backbone of restitution efforts that lasted well into the post-war years. At Aussee, transport required more delicate planning. Many of the paintings and sculptures were fragile. Some had been wrapped in canvas for years. Others were enormous or structurally sensitive. The Americans arranged special convoys with padded interiors and temperature control. Museums across Europe sent representatives to assist with cataloguing and handling. The transport of these treasures was one of the most carefully executed logistical operations of the entire war. In the days and weeks that followed, word of the recoveries began to spread, not through newspapers, but through quiet conversations among Allied officers. Many recognized that these operations had prevented the erasure of enormous pieces of European heritage. The relief among cultural experts was profound. For the first time since the war began, there was a moment where something lost had actually been saved. Yet even as the Americans worked to secure and transport the treasures, another realization emerged. If Merkers and Aussee had yielded caches of this magnitude, what else might still be hidden in the Alps, the forests, or the collapsing urban centers of Germany? The hunt, in many ways, was not over. The discoveries in the Merkers and Aussee mines did not mark the end of the treasure hunt. They marked the beginning of an entirely new phase, one that would shape post-war justice, intelligence practices, and the cultural landscape of Europe for decades. As the war drew to a close, American authorities faced a challenge unlike anything they had prepared for: determining the rightful ownership of thousands of objects and the fate of a nation's stolen wealth. The first step was establishing a central system of restitution. Allied commands set up collection points across Germany where recovered items were brought, catalogued, and eventually returned to governments or families. In the case of the Merkers gold, the task was relatively straightforward. Most of the bullion bore identifiable marks from national banks, making it possible to return reserves to Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, and other occupied nations. These restitutions would later aid in rebuilding shattered economies, helping nations recover from the financial devastation of the war. For the artworks, the process was far more complex. Many had been taken from museums, others had been stolen from Jewish families whose members had been killed or scattered across the world. The monuments men worked tirelessly, cross-referencing museum inventories, private collection lists, and wartime records. For years after the war, crates continued to be unpacked, studied, and matched to their original owners. Some pieces made their way back to museums where they had hung for centuries. Others were entrusted to governments while families searched for survivors. The discoveries also rewrote the understanding of Nazi ambitions. Until the caches were uncovered, the full extent of the cultural theft had never been fully visible. The scale was astonishing. The regime had not simply collected art, it had attempted to assemble a cultural empire. The Aussee mine alone contained enough masterpieces to fill a museum larger than any single institution in Europe. The Americans understood that, had the Nazis succeeded, they would have controlled not only the territories they conquered, but the narrative of Europe's artistic history. From an intelligence perspective, Merkers and Aussee became case studies in the power of field interrogation, resistance networks, and rapid analysis. They demonstrated that even in the final weeks of a collapsing regime, information could be pieced together to reveal patterns of strategic behavior. OSS teams learned that rumors, when carefully cross-examined and triangulated, could unlock truths hidden beneath mountains of secrecy. These lessons influenced the early methods of post-war intelligence agencies, including the newly formed CIA. The recoveries also played a role in shaping the earliest tensions of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, having captured large caches of art and gold in the East, claimed them as reparations. The Western Allies, in contrast, framed the return of recovered property as a moral obligation. These contrasting approaches highlighted ideological differences that would deepen in the years ahead. Yet for all the broader consequences, the emotion that dominated the immediate aftermath was relief. Relief that the Reich had failed to destroy what it had stolen. Relief that the meticulous sabotage efforts of miners and civilians prevented irreversible loss. Relief among soldiers who understood they had protected not only the present, but the memory of the past. Still, questions lingered. Many rumors persisted about trains buried in tunnels, convoys that vanished in forests, or SS officers who escaped with pockets full of diamonds. Some of these stories were exaggerations. Others contained grains of truth. Even today, the legend of lost Nazi gold continues to surface in documentaries, treasure hunts, and speculation about what might still lie undiscovered. But the reality remains clear. The greatest treasures, the gold of the Reichsbank, and the masterpieces of Europe's museums were saved. They were not left to rot in mines. They were not scattered across the black market. They did not vanish into the chaos of the war's final days. They were found, catalogued, protected, and returned. And the mission that preserved them, driven by intelligence work, local resistance, and the determination of American forces, stands as one of the most remarkable recoveries in modern history. The war in Europe ended with gunfire, surrender, and the collapse of a regime built on brutality. But some of its most profound moments unfolded in silence, deep underground, in caverns where the last secrets of the Third Reich had been hidden. When American soldiers stepped into those mines, they were not only entering the final vaults of a dying empire, they were stepping into the physical memory of a continent that had been plundered, terrorized, and nearly erased. The discovery of the Merkers gold and the Aussee art did more than reveal the scale of Nazi theft. It exposed the mindset of a regime that believed it could rewrite history by possessing the symbols of Europe's wealth and culture. Gold was power, art was identity. By seizing both, the Reich had attempted to control not only the economies of nations, but their cultural souls. Yet in the end, the treasures did not remain in German hands. They did not vanish into hidden vaults. They did not burn under the scorched earth orders of desperate officers. They were found by soldiers who had come to Europe to end a war, and discovered that part of their duty was to save the very heritage that defined the civilization they were fighting to protect. The mines held more than objects, they held questions. What does it mean for a nation to steal the cultural history of another? What does it mean for armies to fight not only over land but over memory? How close had Europe come to losing centuries of art, knowledge, and identity in an instant? The answers lay in crates, stamped with museum numbers, in ledgers listing stolen gold, and in the quiet determination of people who refused to let destruction become the final chapter. There was irony in the preservation itself. The regime that had consumed Europe in flames had, through fear and desperation, protected the very treasures it meant to claim. Salt caverns, chosen for their stability, had shielded paintings from bombs. Mines meant for industry had become vaults for masterpieces. Even the SS, in moments of confusion or collapse, failed to carry out the destruction they were ordered to deliver. In those gaps, those moments where ideology faltered and humanity resurfaced, the future was preserved. For the American forces, the mission left a lasting imprint. Many soldiers who participated in the recoveries wrote later that it was the first time they understood the full cultural dimension of the war. They had seen ruined cities, liberated camps, and devastated lives. But in those underground chambers, they saw what could have been lost forever, not just paintings or gold bars, but the tangible expression of human creativity across centuries. The return of the stolen treasures became one of the quiet triumphs of the post-war world. Nations received back pieces of their past. Museums reopened rooms that had been empty since the occupation. Families reclaimed objects that were the last remaining ties to lives destroyed in the Holocaust. Each restitution was a reminder that victory meant more than military defeat. It meant restoration. And yet, the mines also forced a deeper reflection. What is the value of a civilization's heritage? Why do people risk their lives to protect it? Why did Austrian miners defy the SS? Why did American soldiers guard paintings as carefully as they guarded ammunition? The answer lies in the understanding that history is not merely written in books or remembered in stories. It lives in the objects that societies create, cherish, and pass down. Losing those objects would have meant losing a part of humanity itself. In the quiet aftermath of the war, as Europe rebuilt and borders shifted, the story of the mines faded into the background. But its significance did not. It stood as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, acts of preservation can define the legacy of a conflict. It showed that courage is not only found on battlefields, but also in mines where explosions never detonated, and in rooms where soldiers carried paintings instead of rifles. The Americans who hunted Nazi gold across the Alps were not chasing treasure for glory, they were safeguarding the future. They were ensuring that the world emerging from the ruins would still have access to the beauty, wealth, and culture that defined its past. And in doing so, they demonstrated that victory in war is measured not only by what is destroyed, but by what is saved. The mines are quiet now. The tunnels are empty. But the legacy of what was recovered still hangs on museum walls, sits in national reserves, and lives in the memories of the nations that were rebuilt. It is a silent testament to a mission that unfolded beneath the mountains, a mission where spies, soldiers, miners, and ordinary civilians came together to protect the remnants of a civilization threatened by extinction. And it endures as one of the most extraordinary reminders of World War II, that even in the final days of a collapsing empire, the world chose preservation over destruction, truth over concealment, and memory over oblivion.